I haven't done a talk for a long while, so forgive me any rambling or inconsistencies. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Android UI, the new Android UI toolkit called Compose, and how I started learning it, and hopefully some tips along the way. By the way, this is me on Twitter. I'm an Android developer for Just Takeaway in Bristol at the moment. So what we're going to talk about, firstly, just a quick definition of Compose for people who are not in the Android domain or elsewhere. Then I'm going to tell you how I started my journey, some first steps along the way of implementing a UI in Compose. Then I'm going to talk about a library that gave me a helping hand on the way as part of Just Eat.
A bit louder, Barbs.
Pardon?
A bit louder, please.
A bit louder?
Yeah.
Okay, Rich. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, turn up hearing aid. We haven't got a loop, but okay. And then building blocks are going to be Compose components that hopefully I can give you some tips about that we used, and then stumbling blocks, some things that got hard along the way, and then hopefully some next steps of evolving what I did in Compose and taking it further. So what is Compose? It's the Android's recommended modern toolkit for building native UI. That's straight off the website, and essentially it's a declarative API in Kotlin to define your UI. So on the left here we've got the traditional XML approach that's used. So you define your layout there, and then you instantiate it in the activity, which is effectively a screen. And then on the right you've got a simple example of how it would look in Compose. So very similar on the activity side, but as I said, it's all in Kotlin, and you've got some annotations going on there to tell you it's Compose. So some of the benefits of that: it's interoperable with the old way of doing things, the Vue, and as I said, use the power of Kotlin language, which we'll go into later, and encourages separated state from the Vue, which is activities and fragments, which basically gives a better structure and allows for better testing. So starting off, these were a few links. I've put a lot of links in this talk, so if you need to reference them, the links down there to the actual talk, so don't worry about taking notes. The code labs were brilliant. Google's upped its game with documentation, and if you need to, from animation to state and everything in between, the code lab's a great way of starting and actually using some code. And again, the sample apps are great, all sorts of examples of UI there. And if you're like me and you learn by doing, then yeah, that's a great place to go. One of the questions I asked myself when learning Compose was, what's the equivalent in the Vue world? I know how to create XML, I know how all the components, the buttons, but this was a question that reoccurred. So there's a nice website where you can put in an edit text or an image view, and you can then, it'll give you the Compose equivalent component, which we'll see sometimes is not always one-to-one. And then there's a couple of developer books that are great. I've not read them, but these two guys are amazing in the Android community, and yeah, you should check them out. So the first step was start small. We've done some composing the rest of the Just Eat app on a much smaller scale, just individual components on the screen. But I decided to go for a whole screen. I had an opportunity to refactor the checkout from this one on the left to that one on the right. So I thought, let's try Compose and see how it fits in. So this is very high level. I've tried to keep it simplistic, but these are my thoughts at the start. The architecture that I had in the app at the time was fairly modern, so it was sort of, we'll go over that in a minute. So there's only a slight refactor there. I wanted to create a Compose skeleton of the screen you see here with help of this Android UI library, which I'll touch on as well. and then once I got those two things, I could then respond to state to update this view and populate it, etc. So this was the very rough architecture, and as I said, we had the sort of Jetpack Compose components, we had the view model, and state was in a state flow which we could respond to in the fragment, and as you can see, yeah, the XML concept. So essentially, we were taking out the fragment and the XML and replacing it with composables. There was some logic on the fragment to listen to state and some things relating to navigation that had to move to the activity. But keep in mind, this was just one screen of multiples, so there's other fragments around, so this was like a first venture into changing things. And then, as I said, respond to state on the actual composable then, which was held in the view model. So going back to the equivalent between XML, the XML view world, and Compose, again, this was my thinking. I had this screen, and in my head I was thinking, okay, edit text there, image view button, radio button, which is great. But then, as I said, there are equivalents in Compose, but it's not a one-to-one mapping, and sometimes you get a lot for free in the view world. So a good example is this edit text, which is, yeah, a bit of a minefield. So we'll cover that in a minute. But yeah, it's nice to have that kind of first thought when you go through things. So along the way, I had this helping hand as I was developing that screen. Other developers in Just Eat were trying to address this problem where over the years we've had multiple refreshes of the UI and theming and styling. So we decided to come up with a more sort of future-proof version. This is a great blog that one of my colleagues did about how we did that, and essentially it was just taking an output from a designer's tool, say a JSON file, processing the styles and themes via some templating, and then pushing that into some XML and Kotlin files, which then could be consumed, and yeah, as I said, when the style changes, that made things a lot easier. How that links to Compose is that we had a load of reusable Compose components that we started to add to this library. So obviously, you know, as a community of developers, we all contribute to that, and that helped me on my journey of building up this Compose view. And obviously, we had a sample app with all the different components. So I'm just going to go through a few elements on this screen and just pick out a few composables that might give you an insight into how this screen was built. First one is the Constraint Layout, which, if you're an Android developer, you know this is something that a lot of XML views contain these days because it improves efficiency of when the view gets rendered, and Google gave it to us to sort of help with like really complex views. So instead of like a linear layout with lots and lots of rows, this was meant to make performance a bit better. In the Compose world, it's not such a problem, so you know, don't use this everywhere, but sometimes it helps out with use cases like, not that this is a really complex view, but with spacing and relative parameters, UI components to each other. So briefly, in Compose, you create references, as you can see there, and then you use the modifier, which is quite a lot of things go on in the modifier with composables, but you can then, in this example, specify a status icon, and then you can determine the layout of your components relative to each other. So yeah, that's a quick whistle-stop tour of that one. Another thing about when we were building it is, again, going back to Kotlin, it's a very powerful language, and having that in the UI layer, because it's declarative, means you can do things like this. You can pass a mapping of values, and you can iterate. So on this pay component, we did exactly that, so that in future, if we need to add further payment methods, then yeah, it just means that the UI is a bit more flexible when you render it. Another building block was this one that I found, which is PreviewParameterProvider. Bit of a tongue twister. Essentially, you've got a class that holds some test data. So in Compose, you've got this concept of previews. You had something similar in the view world, but they're a little bit more reactive in Compose. Fly is nicely circling it for me. Down. Yeah, so as you can see, I've annotated it there with preview parameter and pass this class in. So you can have like really, sort of previews that are real world and put real world data, sort of test data in there, which makes it, and it's reusable, which is the key. This is another building block, accompanist. Got it. This is a library that Google, someone at Google created when they were creating Compose, and then when he left, it got adopted and expanded. So if you weren't aware of this, I'd suggest looking through it once you've got your basic layout there. We used it for this purpose with the Shimmer Layout. I went looking for a Shimmer Layout for Compose, but it turns out there's one in here, and it's really easy to implement. You just add property on the modifier, and then it renders your layout currently as it is, and puts the shimmer just over the top. So really quick win there, loads of tools in it. Obviously, testing is always best practice for testing your layouts. Make sure they're conforming, and if you make any changes, you're not breaking the layout. So this is just a quick high-level look at it. In Compose, testing's slightly different. So I went down the traditional testing path of keeping it a bit more like Espresso in the view world, where you've still got the same concept of setting a rule at the start of your test against a component activity, and then you can test individual composables. So we've got the rule there, and then you just set the theme on it, and you can actually, I'm testing the location component that you can see there. And then it's a similar concept with a tree of items, and you can find them in different ways with tags that you specify on the actual composables, like I've got there, or strings of text. There's also, if you're struggling to find the actual component, you can use the layout inspector to sort of drill down into the hierarchy, so that's quite handy. Onto the stumbling blocks. As I said at the start, edit text in the old view world, or it's called basic text view in Compose, is a bit of a hornet's nest. So unfortunately, I picked the hardest composable to start with, and I later found out that even Google has struggled to sort of define this composable, and there's some sort of internal state issues with it, but there's a great blog article there, and they're constantly improving it, and releasing new versions of Compose, so that's worth a read. Just have a drink. I think I packed too much into this talk. So stumbling blocks, state management is, and where to put it, is one of the biggest things that you wrestle with when you're doing Compose. As I said, there's a really great code lab on it that you can run through, and that kind of gets your head into that way of thinking. But even as you're developing, you're still struggling to know, right, do I bring the state down to this composable, or do I pass it all the way up to the view model? Keep reading up on that as you're learning, and hopefully, will eventually sink in. Other complexities on that page were dynamic field validation. Great blog post there that we used, where it uses flows to pass that state round in a loop, so as you're typing, it can update the state of the screen. But later I learned that there's a better way of doing it. So as I said, Compose is always evolving, there's always new things coming out, and yeah, derived state of apparently is the way to do it now. I put this in stumbling blocks, but it could be in building blocks, accessibility changes. We always try and make accessible apps, and yeah, we usually use the accessibility scanner to run through the layout, as you can see here, and bring up any issues. But in Compose, accessibility is done slightly different. You've still got the concept of content descriptions, which are these things being read out as the screen reader is going through the items, and that's usually in this modifier called semantics. There are other things, like if you've got custom composable and it's got a clickable area, you can then set this on click label to, I found that was a bit of an edge case, so worth noting. Next steps, future testing. Will, as I said, I want to expand on this. I've used just the basic rules of Compose testing, but we've got some of this in the Just Eat app already. As I said, other people have attempted Compose as well, and this is a great way of just having that sort of pixel comparison. We've got an internal library, but it's based off some of the samples that I mentioned earlier. And it's really simplistic, it just takes a screenshot and does the comparison, and then we've rolled it into our CI so that we can get some more verification. And then obviously replacing more fragments with Compose and doing it in a progressive manner, because as I said, it's interoperable, so you can do it as fast or slow as you want. And then logically, once we've got to that state of more Compose, eventually we might want to go down this route of using Compose navigation. Currently we use sort of the traditional Android intents and fragment manager to navigate, but yeah, this needs a lot more investigation to see the feasibility, the edge cases. And I went to a great talk at DroidCon about multi-module navigation, which was a bit of our fear because we've got a fairly big app, 100 modules or something. So yeah, this is obviously something we need to think about, and is a future thought really. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Any questions?
How long did it take you to go from, do you write all your new stuff in Compose now? I was just wondering the talk was about the journey, how long did it take you? Did you feel comfortable in doing something in Compose?
Yeah, I think it took a while, as I said at the start, to switch that frame of mind from the view world to the Compose world. And I didn't mention it, but in some of those things they call it state hoisting, where they're talking about moving the state up, and even that now I struggle with some of that and where to put it. But yeah, it took a fair while to sort of get our head into it. But I think as a collective, it was a lot easier because there was other people working on Compose. And as I said, that library was great because people had already made certain components, and then we just collaborated on that library and found edge cases. But yeah, I think this was our first full screen. But other parts of the search are now, since then, have been completely converted. But they started off with small components, just widgets and things like that.
What does your existing screenshot testing look like, and how much energy is it going to be to convert over to this new type that you're moving to?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure about how much time and energy, but yeah, a lot is probably the answer. But I guess we're invested in the native way of doing things, and I think there are a lot of benefits, maintainability and testability, and obviously just sort of obviously the mobile platform is moving on, and this is kind of the way that Android's going. So yeah, from a business point of view, I guess it could be argued against, definitely. But I think once we're invested in native mobile, then yeah, there's lots of benefits going that way.
When you're looking at testing composed functions, have you found a way to do it without it being an instrumented test?
Yeah, I think we have had some debates on that. There's a new composed test rule, I think. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. It's a sort of an empty rule they've just brought out in the newest version.
Right.
And I think that allows you to do more sort of integrated tests rather than the isolated ones. And obviously, yeah, we've got the more simplistic screenshot testing that works quite well because we've integrated with the CI, and it puts sort of golden screenshots in the directories, and then it puts the mismatched ones in the CI, so you can generates ones so that you can then just copy them over. So
Yeah.
we have got try to improve that process.
Shall we swap over? Thank you very much, Ali.